Hello everyone, I would like to welcome you to another video of the channel Questions and Analysis. This is going to be in English and this is the first video that we are conducting in this language. Why we are doing this? This is one of the videos that's going to be under the list current issues, which is currently speaking specifically about the Palestinian cause. Now, in this video, we are going to show testimonies of different Israelis that are talking about what is internationally named the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which is not really a conflict. You are going to hear them talk about what is happening in Palestine from an Israeli perspective, not from a Palestinian perspective. They are going to expose the truth. You will be hearing from citizens, from soldiers, from journalists, from authors, from different perspectives of the Israeli societies about what is really happening in Palestine. If you are watching this video, this is going to be a long video. This is against the advices of every person who I know about YouTube. They're telling me that a YouTube video should be a short one so that people will be tempted to watch it. Now, this video is about the truth. If you are interested to know the truth, then you would not care about the length of this video. If you are watching this video and you think it is important so that the world would know about what the Israelis themselves are saying about what is happening in Palestine, then please share this video so that the world would know. Now, on another perspective, I have done a research that would tackle the perspective of Palestinians. I tried to get Palestinians to defend the Israelis. I couldn't find one single source. My research about the Israelis was extremely simple. I put the term Israelis exposing the truth. This is what I searched for. And the content that you are going to see in this video is only a sample of the videos available on the internet. I tried to search for the opposite, where Palestinians are defending Israelis. I couldn't find sources. Next, now, you will know that I am keeping the best for the last. The last interview is extremely important. I will start with the videos one by one. I will not be interrupting them. I will not be commenting on them. Now, another thing that I need to mention is that some of those videos are without subtitles. Now, to do subtitles for them, it would take a long time from me, and I wanted to get this content out as soon as possible. So let's move on and hear those testimonies from different Israeli citizens, journalists, authors, and soldiers.
I'm an American, and I'm also someone who holds Israeli citizenship. I lived there for 3.5 years in my childhood, and I was always told that Israel was only ever defending itself, that it was never the aggressor, that the Palestinian people were always the aggressors, and that they only wanted death to all Jews and all of Israel. Well, the wool has been pulled from my eyes, and it's not just what's happening now, it is what has been happening. From the open-air prisons, to the checkpoints, to the blockades, to the lack of human rights, water, electricity, the COVID vaccine, all of it, children being ripped from their families, homes being stolen by Zionists. This cannot continue. Everyone must stand with Palestine. I stand for a free Palestine. This must end, and it must end now.
I think that for the most cases I did feel comfortable with what I was doing, and that's because I was convinced that it was for the security of Israel. Now, what we do in Breaking the Silence is ask questions far beyond just security, like what is the moral price for that security? Is that the kind of security we want to live with as a society? Now, I know that isn't what I want my society to be doing, and I know that the occupation isn't justified in any moral terms.
There cannot be an occupation that will be moral or that will conduct itself in a good way. It's the problem is inherent in the mission, and the mission is occupying people without them having rights and dignity. One issue was this issue of settler violence, which is not really discussed within Israeli society. And what I saw through my view from the operations room was time and again how acts of violence against Palestinians are just under rug swept and covered up by the military. Inevitably, it will end because, like all other oppressive regimes and undemocratic regimes, they fail to sustain, be sustainable. And I think deeply, as long as Palestinians don't have security, we're not going to have security.
Oh my home, oh my home.
The two-state solution left the station a long time ago. You, Wada, you say that he died, it was never born. Let's be honest about it. It was never born. I believed in it for years. I was an advocate of the two-state solution when very few Israelis were advocating two-state solution. I thought it's a courageous idea, a wonderful idea. Two peoples share one land. Let's share the land between the two peoples. What is more just than this? The only thing I didn't know is that nobody in Israel means to go for it. Ever, 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 never, never, ever. There was not a single Israeli prime minister, not a single Israeli government who had an intention to go for the two-state solution. There was never an Israeli prime minister or Israeli government who had the slightest intention to put an end to the occupation. They had all kinds of tricks to gain time, to strengthen the occupation, to strengthen the settlements. The peak of it was obviously the Oslo Accords, which I supported. I remember, again, maybe I'm too emotional. I remember, I really thought, that's it. We reached a stage in which the way for peace and justice is open. But it was a trap. I know it only now, I didn't know it then. Only in order to gain time. Only in order to strengthen the occupation. How do I know? Because Oslo, even this courageous process which brought Nobel Peace Prize to some people, even this process didn't mention the core issue then, and this is the settlements. And when you don't touch the settlements, you have no intention to put an end to the occupation. And if you don't agree, first of all, to freeze this whole criminal project, and then to evacuate the settlements, there are no two states. You know, all those conditions. Listen to the language of those who support two-state solution or claim that they are supporting the two-state solution. Palestine must be demilitarized. Sorry, why should Palestine be demilitarized? Don't they have the right of self-defense? Aren't their life in danger much more than we Israelis? What other country in the world is demilitarized? Why would they be demilitarized? Why can Israel possess any possible weapon in the world and Palestine has no right to have any kind of weapon? What kind of justice is this? Based on what? On being the chosen people? On being the victims of the Holocaust? On what? And what does this has to do with the Palestinians' rights? And that's only one example. The two-state solution was never born. Israel went for it after many years of opposing it because they saw that this can lead to decades and decades of occupation without doing anything, only strengthening the settlements. We have no partner. You know, Arafat was too strong, Abbas is too weak, Hamas is too fundamentalistic. We don't have a partner. Israel is a partner, obviously, for anything, but there is no Palestinian partner. How unfortunate. Many times I'm being told in Israel, oh, you draw the picture in black and white, and it's not black and white. It is so complex. My friends, it is black and white. And those who say that it's complex don't want to see the truth. It is black and white because it's very clear if you look at the history from 48, even not from 48. I'm reading now the biography of Ben Gurion written by Tom Segev. I recommend it to everyone. In the 20s, they took already the jobs of the Palestinians systematically. No Holocaust, no security, nothing.
One single incident that did change your mind about taking that risk and speaking out?
It's not one single incident. No, it's 2 years that I served in the West Bank, what I experienced and things that I've done. From bursting into houses in the middle of the night and seeing the families and how they react, till manning checkpoints, arrest operations, and other things that I've done. It's a whole package.
And when you reached that point, were you revolted by what you had witnessed? I mean, once you started to explore all those past incidences, did you start rethinking the whole package?
Yeah, definitely yes. I think mainly for me was learning things about myself way before about the big politics. I went through my service believing that I'm a good guy and that we are the good side. And suddenly I discovered what we've done and what I took part in. And that's why I felt that I need to do something.
And how would you...
הבנתי שכאילו, בשביל להיות שם, אז צריך לשבור להם את הרוח, לשבור אותם. לשבור אותם זה אומר שיחכו, ושיהיה להם בד על העיניים, ושתייחסו להם לא יפה, ושיכתבו מוות לערבים על השכפ"ץ.
And in breaking the silence, we are over 950 combat soldiers who say, occupation, no. Yeah, that is wrong. This is not the path to go.
Is it possible for an Israeli soldier to serve in the territories with a clear conscience?
I don't believe that a soldier who served in the occupied territories has clean hands. It's not that I think that we are all, it's not that every soldier murders innocent Palestinians. Far away from that. But no Israeli soldier who served in the occupied territories, his hands were clean after that. Because at the heart of what you do, there is no way of seeing Palestinians as equal human beings to you. I'll just give you one example, which is, nothing extreme, nothing exceptional, something very routine and banal. I served for 14 months in Hebron. Right now in Hebron, as we are sitting here and having this discussion, there are 2 military patrols that their job is to do what we call in the military to make our presence felt. What does it mean? The military logic says this. If Palestinians will get the feeling that the IDF is all the time everywhere, they'll be afraid to attack. So what do you do to give them this feeling? You make your presence felt. You start your night shift patrol. 10 o'clock till 6 o'clock in the morning, 8-hour shift. You walk in the streets of the old city of Hebron. Break into a house, Palestinian house, of course. Not a house we have intelligence about. I'm the sergeant. I lead the patrol. I choose a random house. Wake up the family, men one side, women the other side. Search the place. You can yourself imagine the dynamics, yeah? Climb to the roof, jump from one roof to another, come out through another house, wake the family. And basically that's how you pass your 8-hour shift. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. From September 2000, when the second Intifada started, till today, now. It didn't stop for 1 second. Yeah, the idea is that every Palestinian will feel the military is right here. You don't know when we're going to show up, what we're going to do, when it's going to end, how it's going to look like. It's to do what we call in the military, ליצור תחושת נרדפות, to create the feeling of being persecuted. Now, when this is your mission, again, this is not an action of a rogue soldier or officer. This is your mission. There is no way of doing it nice.
كله ילדים קטן, كله. نايف يا مان دعم نايف يا مان دعم دلال بيمش خفيش جيش خفيش هذا عمره شو اسمه 8 سنين.
ها؟
8.
8
وهذا عمره 11 سنة.
ها؟
11.
I realized that my job is actually to maintain an apartheid system. Very early on, I understood that the rights that the Jewish settlers have are not the rights that the Palestinians have. I understood that I cannot touch a Jewish settler if he is attacking a Palestinian. The best I can do is call a local police department to come handle it, like I would do at home in Jerusalem. So these Jewish settlers that live in Hebron are living under the same rights that I live in Jerusalem, but the Palestinian next to them, next house over, next building over, sometimes next apartment over, lives under my rule, my military rule. And I can do whatever I want with him. I can take his home as a temporary base for a few hours, to a few days, to a few weeks. I can decide that I'm arresting the people of the house and tying them up to the fence of my base. If we will get an order to demolish their home or just lock their front door and don't let them out into the street their house is on, a street that only Jewish settlers can walk on and Palestinians cannot. So they have to walk through windows to yards, into the other side, into the Kasbah of Hebron. I think realizing all of that in a very, very early stage in my service helped me understood that someone was lying to me along the way. I didn't feel like I'm protecting anyone. I didn't feel like I'm helping anyone feeling more safe. I feel like I'm terrorizing people. I feel like for the first time in my life, the boundaries between good and bad that I learned as a kid, and obviously I learned that I'm on the good side, was broken. I felt like I am the terrorist. And my job was literally to scare people so they cannot think about acting against the Israeli settlers or the Israeli military. That was actually our defined mission, to make sure that to instill fear in the hearts of Palestinians in Hebron. And that's exactly what we did.
Just from personal experience?
Sure, definitely. Just the other week, when some border police soldiers were rough with some Christian tourists, another soldier of mine, a colleague, said she couldn't believe what they were doing. I mean, come on, they're people, not they're people, not Palestinians. And that, I think, resonates throughout much of the soldiers in the occupied territories. I personally serve in the Jordan Valley, and we can see it every day, how soldiers talk about what they're doing, how they act, how they look at these people not as other human beings, not as someone who's equal, but as someone who is less than them. And to think that, oh no, we can just leave that racism there, we can leave that xenophobia, no, they'll only be racist, they'll only humiliate Palestinians, of course not. And what this motion is how it will affect Israel.
This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. On Thursday, the House of Representatives overwhelmingly passed a resolution condemning anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim discrimination, white supremacy, and other forms of hate. The resolution, as initially written, was seen as a direct rebuke of Democratic Congressmember Ilhan Omar for her comments about U.S. foreign policy with Israel. The vote capped a week of intense debate among congressional Democrats about anti-Semitism and U.S. policy on Israel. We're joined now by three guests. In Tel Aviv, Gideon Levy, longtime Israeli journalist, Haaretz columnist, member of the newspaper's editorial board. His latest piece headlined, "Keep It Up, Ilhan Omar." He's also the author of The Punishment of Gaza. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Let's go to Tel Aviv first. Gideon Levy, your response to the debate and the final passage of the resolution on Thursday in the House of Representatives.
It's wonderful that the House deals with anti-Semitism. It's wonderful that the House condemns anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism should be condemned, but the context is very suspicious and very troubling. Let me be very frank with you, Amy. We have to say the truth. The Israeli lobby, the Jewish lobby, are by far too strong and too aggressive. It's not good for the Jewish community. It's not good for Israel. What is happening now is that some kind of fresh air, some kind of new voices are emerging from Capitol Hill, raising legitimate questions about Israel, about America's foreign policy toward Israel, and about the Israeli lobby in the States. Those are very legitimate questions, and it is more than needed to raise them. But the Israeli propaganda and the Jewish propaganda in recent years made it as a systematic method. Whenever anybody dares to raise questions or to criticize Israel, he is immediately and automatically labeled as anti-Semite, and then he has to shut his mouth, because after this, what can he say? This vicious circle should be broken, and I really hope that great politicians like Mrs. Omar and others will be courageous enough to stand in front of those accusations and to say, yes, it is legitimate to criticize Israel. Yes, it is legitimate to raise questions, and this does not mean that we are anti-Semites. We are not ready to play this game anymore in which they shut our mouths with those accusations, which in most of the cases are hollow.
What kind of effect does this debate? Now, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and Andre Carson, the three Muslim Congress members, applauded the final resolution, saying it's the first time that there was this anti-Islamophobia resolution that was passed by the House of Representatives. Of course, in addition to the anti-Semitism issue, they broadened it out. What kind of effect does this debate have in Israel? And, you know, you're just about to have your elections. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is just about to be indicted for corruption.
Yeah, as you probably know, Amy, the campaign in Israel deals only with one question, Netanyahu, yes or no, and many more important questions and crucial questions and fatal questions are even not being discussed. But in any case, Mrs. Omar will be also portrayed in Israel, as in any other place in the Jewish communities, as an anti-Semite, as a dangerous woman, as an enemy of peace, an enemy of Israel, an enemy of the Jewish people. And, you know, the propaganda, this kind of propaganda is very, very efficient. And we just have, I just got so many emails after my last piece, and someone asked me, how can a Jew support such a woman? So I answered him very easily, very, very easily, because she seems to be courageous and she seems to say the truth. And it's about time to say the truth. And yes, Amy, to ask, do we support automatically and blindly the occupation? Is it legitimate to criticize the occupation? Maybe it is legitimate to handle Israel as South Africa was handled. Maybe BDS is something that we should consider. Those questions are even not legitimate to raise in the United States. And maybe now this vicious circle will be broken and people will have the courage, the guts, and the power to ask questions. Yes, everything is questioned. Even God is questionable. So the relations with Israel is not questionable. I saw the other day a congressman say that nobody should question the relations between the United States and Israel. Excuse me? Nobody should question the relations between Israel and the United States? Here from Tel Aviv, I claim that those relationships are corrupted and are bad for peace and bad for Israel for the long run, because the United States let Israel go crazy, continue the occupation, do whatever it wants, and get this automatic and blind support.
Gideon Levy is speaking to us from Tel Aviv, a Jewish reporter with Haaretz newspaper, the Israeli newspaper, and on the editorial board there.
עברו 7 שנים מאז שנשלחתי עם חבריי לכבוש את בית חנון. שומעים אותי? התייצבתי וביצעתי את מה שהמנהיגים דרשו ממני לבצע. בהתחלה רק חשבתי על זה שאני לא רוצה שאני או אחד החברים שלי נמות. על ההרס שהותרנו אחרינו לא חשבתי יותר מדי. אחרי שבועיים של לחימה הכריזו על הפסקת אש ונסגנו. ישבנו על הדיונות מחוץ לבית חנון, וצפינו במטוסי חיל האוויר מטילים פצצות ללא הפסקה. משמידים את השכונה בה שהיינו. בצד השני של הגדר חיכו לנו המשפחות ואזרחים שבאו לחבק את הלוחמים. נדהמתי מהמהירות בה חזרו כולם לשגרה והתקדמו לחייהם. אבל אנחנו לא שכחנו ולא התקדמנו. לא מההרס שראינו, לא מהאלימות בה לקחנו חלק, ולא מהחברים שהקריבו את החיים שלהם במלחמה. בסבב הזה, כשהחלו האזעקות לעלות ולרדת, מיד הרגשתי שאני בדיוק באותו המקום. עברו 7 שנים מאז שישבנו בדיונה מחוץ לבית חנון, והמנהיגים שלנו לא עשו חצי דבר לקדם פתרון מדיני ולמנוע את הסבב הבא. 7 שנים שלא מציעים לנו דבר מלבד ייאוש, בעוד מוכרים לנו אשליה של נורמליות. דורשים מאיתנו לטמון את הראש בחול ולחשוב שהמצב הנוכחי הוא בסדר וטבעי. אבל אין דבר נורמלי בדיקטטורה צבאית, במצור חונק ובמציאות של אפרטהייד בשטחים. אני חושב על החיילים שעכשיו ממלאים את הפקודות. אלה שמבצעים היום את המשימות שאני נשלחתי לבצע בעזה ובגדה. אני חושב על הוראות פתיחה באש שקיבלתי, על השקר שמכרו לי שאין אזרחים בבית חנון, על 2 הילדים האחים שאני נשלחתי לעצור כי הם היו קרובים מדי לגדר ההפרדה. לכן הצטרפתי לשוברים שתיקה ולמאבק בכיבוש. מבקשים מאיתנו להאמין שאפשר להתעלם מהכיבוש ושהכל יהיה בסדר. הם מבקשים מאיתנו להאמין שהפלסטינים אינם קיימים, ואלו שקיימים רק רוצים להשמיד אותנו, ושהם בני אדם פחותים. אני מסרב לקבל כל אחת מההנחות האלה. אני יודע שאין אף עם בעולם שיש לו את הזכות לשלוט בעם אחר. אין אף אדם בעולם ששווה יותר מרעהו. אני מסרב לקבל את הטענה שאין אפשרות מלבד זו הנוכחית. אני יודע שאנחנו לא נהיה חופשיים לעולם, כל עוד אנחנו נדרשים לשלוט בשכנינו. כדי שיקום פה דור שלא ייאלץ לעצור ילדים, לפלוש לבתים באמצע הלילה, או לחסות בפלנלית עיניים של נתין חסר זכויות, אנחנו חייבים לדרוש מהמנהיגים שלנו להפסיק לזלזל בנו ולשקר לנו ולהתחיל לעבוד ולחתור לקראת פתרון מדיני שיסיר את השליטה שלנו באחינו ואחיותינו הפלסטינים. אנחנו לא רוצים לחיות מסבב לסבב, ואנחנו לא רוצים לשלוט בעם אחר. כולנו, יהודים וערבים, רוצים ביטחון וחירות. מגיעה לנו מציאות טובה יותר. תודה רבה.
In yesterday's video where I talked about Israel and Palestine, I spoke of my personal feeling that people that aren't directly affected ought remain serene and calm and yield the floor to people that have personal investment and are closely and directly affected by these issues. That's why I've had a couple of conversations this week from, I suppose you'd have to say, different opposing sides of this very serious matter. Certainly a matter that I consider to be complex, but people on either side sometimes think and directly claim is a simple matter, as a sort of, I suppose, a further indication of how polarizing this matter is. The first of the conversations that took place on my podcast, Under the Skin, is with Dr. Gabor Mate, the therapist and writer, physician, and I would say sort of modern day shaman. But furthermore, and significantly with regards to this matter, he is a Holocaust survivor. Many of his family members were killed in the Holocaust. He had this to say about the situation in Israel now. It's one of the most beautiful, profound and effective things I've ever seen anybody say about this conflict, and I fail to see how anybody could, I think anybody who sees it will be deeply moved by Gabor Mate's wisdom and truth, his directness and his passion and his compassion.
This is one of the issues that's closest to my heart, and it has been for a long time. So, you know my history, I don't have to repeat it, but I'm personally a Holocaust survivor as an infant. I barely survived. My grandparents were killed in Auschwitz, and most of my extended family was killed. That's my personal background. I grew up ashamed of my Jewishness. In Hungary, after the war, I was still bullied for being Jewish. And I remember one of my friends coming to my rescue once saying, "Leave him alone, it's not his fault that he's Jewish." It's a fault, but it's not his fault. This was the defense. So I grew up with that. My grandfather, a physician and an author, by the way, who died in Auschwitz, was a good friend of Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was one of the major Zionist leaders and the founder of the party that became Likud, the current government of Israel. So that's my family, and this is my background. In my teenage years in Canada, I became a Zionist. This dream of the Jewish people resurrected in their historical homeland, and the barbed wire of Auschwitz being replaced by the boundaries of a Jewish state with a powerful army. I found it liberating. It was exhilarating to believe in that dream. And I absorbed all that perspective and all that point of view, and I really believed in it. And then I found out that it wasn't exactly like that. That in order to make this Jewish dream a reality, we had to visit a nightmare on the local population. You couldn't, there was a Zionist slogan called a land without a people for a people without a land. But there was no there was no land without a people. There was people living there who'd been living there for hundreds and years or even longer. As a matter of fact, if you want to hear something really interesting, and David Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel, actually subscribed to this. He said this, who are the Palestinians? Because the Jews in Roman times all of them never left Palestine. Many of them stayed there. And some of them, hundreds of years later, converted to Islam. So guess who the Palestinians are? In some ways, they might be descendants of ancient Jews. They are cousins, to say the least, no matter how you look at it. And and there's no way you could have ever created a Jewish state without oppressing and expelling the local population, which is what they did in 1947, beginning in 1947, and first of all with British Empire protection, but they did this, and then in 1948, Jewish Israeli historians, have shown without a doubt that the expulsion of the Palestinians was persistent, it was pervasive, it was cruel, it was murderous, and with deliberate attempt. So that's what's called the Nakba in Arabic, the disaster or the catastrophe. Now in Canada, there's a law that you cannot deny the Holocaust. I don't believe in such laws, by the way. But in Israel, you're not allowed to mention the Nakba, even though it was at the very basis of the foundation of the state. So once I became aware of all this, I was, okay, well, yeah, we created this beautiful dream, but we imposed a nightmare on somebody else. And then I visited the occupied territories, Russell, during the first Intifada. I cried every day for 2 weeks at what I saw. The brutality of the occupation, the petty harassment, the murderousness of it, the burning down of Palestinian or cutting down of Palestinian olive groves, the denial of water rights, the humiliations. And this went on, and it's much worse now than it was then. So this is the background. And it couldn't have been in any other way. Because again, you couldn't have created that exclusive Jewish state without oppressing or expelling the local population. It's the longest ethnic cleansing operation in the 20th and 21st centuries. It's still going on. And who are these people in Gaza? Now you have to go to Gaza. You have to go there to really appreciate it. It's a small area where there are these multiple hundreds of thousands of people. Who are those people? The direct children or grandchildren of the people that were expelled from Israel, or what is now Israel. Now here's the outrage. And I'd like your Zionist friend in the States to tell me this. I, as a Jew, I could land in Tel Aviv tomorrow and demand citizenship under the law of the right of return. But my Palestinian friend in Vancouver, Hannah Kawas, who was born in Jerusalem, can't even visit. Now, if I have the right to return after 2,000 years, if that history is even the way it is, which is itself questionable, but let's assume that it is, if I have the right to return after 2,000 years, how come Hannah hasn't got the right to return after 70 years? So what sense does it? No. So who is Gaza? This desperate, blockaded. Let me stop again. Am I talking too long about this? I'm sorry. This is so important to me, and I know so much about it that I don't even know where to stop.
No, carry on, Gabor, please.
So then you have these miserable people packed into this horrible, people call it the world's largest outdoor prison, which is what it is. Incredible poverty, 50% unemployment. Now Hamas is an Islamic organization that was originally encouraged by Israel and supported by Israel as a counterweight to the secular Palestine Liberation Organization, which Israel didn't want to deal with. And given those conditions, of course people will go for extremist leadership. That's what people do when they're miserable and hopeless and deprived of any possibility whatsoever. You don't have to support Hamas policies to stand up for Palestinian rights. That's a complete falsity. But there were free elections in Gaza, monitored by international community. They were declared to be the freest elections ever held in the Arab world. And Hamas happened to win. And when Hamas won that election, Israel and the United States immediately organized a military coup against them, which Hamas defeated, for which the punishment was this blockade that deprives Hamas of, not Hamas, but Gaza, of food, of medical supplies, of sufficient water. I could go on and on and on and on. And then you have this conflict. And then every time there's a conflict, Israel mows the lawn. That's the expression they use. You know what they call it? They call it mowing the lawn, by which they mean the mass murder of Palestinian civilians. Now, is it true that the Gazans shoot rockets into Israel, killing innocent civilians? Yes, it is. Do I support that? No, I don't. But when it comes to the death of innocent civilians, Israel killed 20,000 Lebanese civilians in 1982 using illegal weapons like cluster bombs in a war that had no justification whatsoever. I could go on and on and on and on, except I'll say that the disproportion of power and responsibility and oppression is so markedly on one side that if you take the worst thing you can say about Hamas, multiplied by 1,000 times, and it still will not meet the Israeli repression and killing and dispossession of Palestinians. Now, that's my view of it. Now, as to this argument that we're not a practicing Jew, your friend can come and visit my family where we have Passover every year with our families. And we talk about how the liberation of the Jews from Egypt cannot just be a Jewish symbol. It has to be an international symbol. If after 2,000 years we can look for liberation and freedom, why can't the Palestinians? So, for him to confuse Zionism with Judaism is a big disservice. And to argue, because it's not true, and because there were Jews all along, right from the beginning. You know, there was a Hebrew, a Jewish philosopher and writer called Ahad Ha'am, who in 1895 said that if we continue to treat the Arabs like this, he says, we're going to have disaster. He said it's in 1895. So there was Jews all along. So for him to conflate Judaism and Jewishness with Zionism is absolutely false. And for him to say that Jews who oppose Israel are not Jews is a slander. And for him to say that anybody who criticizes Israel is an anti-Semite is simply an egregious attempt to intimidate good non-Jews who are willing to stand up for what is true. And as for the final argument, that Israel is subjected to standards that other people are not, it's the other way around. It's the other way around. If you look at the Western press, when Hong Kong demonstrators throw stones at the police in Hong Kong, that's considered to be heroism in the American press. When in Myanmar, the demonstrators throw slingshots at the army, at the oppressive army, they're considered to be heroes in the Western press. When Palestinian kids throw stones at the Israeli soldiers, they're called terrorists. And Israel gets away with a lot more without much less criticism in the Western press than any other country. I'll say one more thing. I was recently contacted by a Palestinian woman from Jericho. She runs a program for Palestinian children who spend time in Israeli jails. 14, 15, 16-year-olds are jailed for months or years. Sometimes they can't see their families for months. And she runs a program for them. You know what she does? She meditates with them. She does Sufi dervish dancing with them, swirling dancing, to bring them out of their stress state. She says, we don't have post-traumatic stress disorder here because the trauma is never post. The trauma is daily, she said. I just wish your Zionist friend would visit the occupied territories in Gaza like I have and let him speak the way he speaks now. If he's got any ounce of humanity left, he would cry like I did for 2 weeks when I was there. Do you remember who Albert Speer was?
Yeah, the architect for the Nazis.
Exactly. So Speer was a Nazi armaments minister and economics minister and Hitler's personal architect, you know. And he was a war criminal and condemned as such. And he wasn't executed, he spent 40 years in Spandau prison after the war. And he had kind of a transformation. And I read his autobiography. And he said, he was often asked, what did you know? And he said, what I knew wasn't the right question. He was talking about the Nazi crimes, the genocide, the brutality, the war atrocities that the Nazis committed, and specifically the attempted, or the genocide, the murder of the Jewish people. And he said, the question wasn't what I knew, the question is what I could have known if I'd wanted to. He said, because I have plenty of hints that, and he describes, for example, how in one of the armaments factories, he runs across some concentration camp prisoners who were seconded to the factory. And he asked them, would you rather be here or in the camp? And he said, the shock on their faces. And I never asked why you look so shocked with that question. Or at one time, a German general, he says to a German general, I should visit the East sometimes. And his general says, you don't want to see what's going on there. And Speer says, I never asked why. Now, so the question is not what he knew, it's what he could have known had he wanted to. Now, we're not living in Nazi Germany. Anybody can go on YouTube and listen to Ilan Pappé, an Israeli historian, totally eloquent on Israeli history, who's living in England now because life became in Israel too difficult for him. Anybody can listen to Norman Finkelstein, a Jewish professor, world expert on Gaza, who was denied tenure at his university because of his public speaking against Israeli policy. You can listen to any number of Israeli Defense Forces soldiers who talk about the brutality that they now regret having committed. You can listen to Israeli pilots who talk about why they refuse to fly over Gaza because of the atrocities they're made to commit. You can get all the information you want. So if anybody these days doesn't know, it's not because the information is not available. It's not what you know, it's what you could know if you wanted to find out. Now, I can understand the warmth that Jews have for Israel. I used to be in that same camp. I can understand, after the horrors of the Nazi genocide, how we desperately want some protection. I can understand all that. But none of that excuses what we're doing. And none of that excuses not knowing truth and this deliberate attempt to silence anybody who speaks, Jewish or non-Jewish. And that's, Russell, you know what? There are no two sides. I mean, it's always a complex question, but in terms of power and control, and it's pretty straightforward. There was a land with the people living there, and other people wanted it. They took it over, and they continue to take it over, and they continue to discriminate against, oppress, and dispossess that other people. That's what happened, and that's what's happening.
Oh, Gabor, you magnificent man.
And I really wish that non-Jews of goodwill would stand up against the calumny and not be intimidated by this charge of anti-Semitism. I really wish that. And you know what? It's not a question of being pro-Palestinian. I'm not pro-Palestinian. I'm pro-truth. And ultimately, I think what's going on right now is going to be a disaster for Israelis in the long term, because this cannot be sustained. It cannot be sustained. And so I think, and there's a lot of good people in Israel who feel exactly the same way that I do. So it's not a question of being pro-Palestinian. It's a question of, are you in favor of justice and liberty and freedom and truth, or are you not?
That's an extract of my conversation with Dr. Gabor Mate from my podcast, Under the Skin.
What is happening in Palestine is a disgrace to the human race. The oppressors in Palestine have broken every rule, law, right, or even resolutions. They are not abiding by UN resolutions, human rights. They even committed war crimes. The world should stop this disgrace to humanity right now.